Hello, and welcome back to the Deadball Chronicles, the show where we try to find the most interesting team from baseball's most fascinating era. On our premiere episode, we covered the 1876 Chicago White Stockings. The Stockings were the first ever National League pennant winners, and as a refresher, here are some of their statistics. 52 wins, 14 losses, one player manager who would go on to found the sporting goods behemoth, one guy who hit .429 by bunting in basically every at-bat, one Canadian who later tried to popularize baseball on ice, one backup outfielder who was shot in the throat by a cop, two Confederate soldiers, countless insane mustaches, and one documented case of tuberculosis. Overall, they scored a 46 in our very haphazard ranking system, a score that might be good or bad or average, and we probably won't know for a few more episodes. Today we'll be discussing the 1877 Louisville Grays. My original plan was to cover the league champion each year, but the Boston Red Caps proved to be a pretty boring squad, so I pivoted. After all, these videos are in no way about celebrating excellence on the field. The goal here is strictly finding old-timey 19th century nonsense, which brings us to the Grays. Now, the Grays did not win the championship in '77, but many people feel that they would have had it not been for four players who became synonymous with their late season collapse. Four players who struggled down the stretch intentionally. After completing a two-game sweep of the defending champs in August, the Grays had a four-game lead as they fought for the National League pennant. Within days, that lead would disappear, and before the 1878 season, the Grays would disappear as well, along with the four players at the center of baseball's first gambling scandal. The players were banished for life, and the Grays were forced to fold, ending their two-year MLB run in disgrace. Will this tangled web of deception be enough to overtake Chicago as the most interesting team in MLB history? Let's find out. I'm Pat Barker, and these are the Deadball Chronicles. We start today's episode with pitcher Jim Devlin. As the creator of the drop pitch, known today as a sinker, Jim was unquestionably the team's most talented player. And although this show isn't about actual baseball stats, Devlin's eye-popping numbers from 1876 are worth mentioning here. The Grays played 69 games that season. Devlin started 68 of them. He went the distance in all but two, throwing an insane 66 complete games. In his 622 innings, Devlin posted an absurd 1.56 ERA, but thanks to an epic lack of run support that would make even Jacob deGrom or Paul Skeens blush, Devlin's final record sat at 30 wins, 35 losses, and 2 ties. In an era that routinely produced 400 hitters, the Grays were so offensively inept that they only had one regular hitting over 300, and that was Devlin himself. In addition to these Herculean pitching numbers, Devlin led the team in at-bats, hits, runs, doubles, batting average, on-base percentage, and OPS. The end result was an unbelievable 18.3 WAR. And again, that's 18 WAR in a 69-game season, and it nearly doubled the next best player in the league. So, how would Devlin follow up that historic debut MLB season? Well, in one way, it was even more historic. The Grays played 61 games in '77, and Devlin started and finished all 61. That's right, every single one of the Grays' 559 innings was pitched by Devlin, an accomplishment that was never repeated and never will be again. And on the mound, Devlin's performance was almost as excellent as the season before, posting a 35-25 record and a .225 ERA. However, his performance in those losses ended up ensuring that the '77 season would be his last. As I alluded to in the intro, the Grays' 27-13 start would quickly be followed by a 9-game winless streak that would end their pennant run. While there weren't any box scores available for those games, you could see that the Grays only allowed 33 runs across the 9 games, so Devlin still seems to have pitched reasonably well in an effort to convincingly cover his tracks. Later in this video, we'll get to the reason the scandal got exposed, and I promise you, it's 1 million times dumber than you can possibly imagine. Were it not for this insane faux pas, Devlin likely would have never been caught. As it stands, however, he was left to literally beg on his hands and knees for reinstatement every year with no luck. He ended up taking a job as a police officer before dying of tuberculosis at age 34, a tragic ending for the greatest pitcher on earth. Overall, Devlin's story has everything you could want. He invented a pitch, set untouchable pitching records, posted straight-up video game numbers, got embroiled in a scandal, worked an odd job in what should have been the prime of his career, and died of an Oregon Trail disease. Plus, great mustache. And look, I'm not here to judge anyone for throwing games in 1877. They were making like $9 a game and they had families to feed. I mean, not Devlin. He was single and apparently spent the money on jewelry, but Whatever, the point is, I'm not the morality police. I'm only here to judge how interesting these guys are, and Devlin obviously excels in that area. And perhaps the most interesting Devlin factoid of all is that he might be related to me. Devlin and I were both born in Philadelphia, and Devlin was my mother's maiden name. There's a very good chance I was descended from the OG disgraced baseball player, the man who paved the way for Shoeless Joe and Pete Rose and Emmanuel Clase, a true pioneer and maybe also my great-great-great-great-great-great uncle. I'm going to give Jim a 9 out of 10 on the interesting scale with a 1-point escalator in the contract pending the results of this 23andMe test. Oh, and before I move on, please don't use any of that info about my mom's maiden name to steal my passwords online. Thank you. Next up, we have the catcher Pop Snyder. True baseball fans will know him as the inspiration behind the phrase Pop Time, as Snyder was very famous for his quick feet and throwing out would-be base stealers. Nah, I just made that up. You believe me, though. They didn't keep track of base stealing stats back in 1877, but I'm guessing that Pop wasn't gunning down many runners. Mainly because a key part of that process involves actually catching the ball, which was definitely not his strong suit. In reality, Pop Snyder is the owner of 2 other unbreakable Major League records, as he collected a staggering 763 passed balls and made 685 errors as a catcher in his career. Now, before we go killing Pop, it's important that we remember the whole players didn't wear gloves yet thing. It's a key part of this equation. I try not to venture too far past Wikipedia when preparing these videos because these are rabbit holes I don't have nearly enough free time to fall into, but I did do a little fact checking on this point and found a quote from Pop saying that he didn't try wearing a mitt until 1885, which gave him a decade-long head start on setting these infamous marks. The article also mentioned that the mound was only 45 to 50 feet away back then, and pitchers were able to, and I quote, take a hop, skip, or jump before throwing the ball. So yeah, Little League mound distance with no gloves and pitchers get to do an entire goddamn gymnastics floor routine before throwing the pitch. The catcher had to be fighting for his life back there. There isn't a whole lot more that's particularly interesting about Pop. He spent several years as a player/manager, which is cool, and would also umpire when needed, which seems like a huge conflict of interest for a sport trying to recover from a major gambling scandal, but what do I know? I give Pop a 2 on the interesting scale. They hooked me with the catcher who doesn't know how to catch headline, but the actual story was pretty boring. Moving on. Next up, we have Bill Craver, seen here dressed up as Captain America for Halloween when he was 8 years old. Craver is the second of our 4 banished players, and maybe the only one that was wrongfully accused. Without spoiling too much of the gambling story just yet, I will say that the key piece of evidence in the case was telegrams that were sent both to and from the players involved. The other 3 players willingly gave up their telegrams and confessed because they were, say it with me now, suckers. Bill Craver was a real motherfucker though, and when they asked to read his telegrams, he told them where to stick it. Additionally, interviews done in the investigation barely implicated Craver at all. The problem was, Craver had a little bit of an attitude problem and had already gotten into a lot of hot water with his previous teams, including an incident where he got kicked off of his Chicago team in 1870 for a number of behavioral reasons, including gambling. That story is also a little bit wonky, as apparently he was given $10 by someone as a bonus for winning a game, or at least that's his story. I'm sure the team forbade their players from taking money like that. Hell, they had the same rule when I worked at Radio Shack back in college. If you helped someone get a big-ass TV to their car and then they tried to tip you, you had to refuse it. Now, in retrospect, I should have just taken the tips, but I was scared that they were secret shoppers sent in to try and catch us slipping, so I was always on the straight and narrow. Now here I am, making baseball videos while Radio Shack has been dead and buried for years, and that's a big win for me. Anyway, back to Craver. In 1876, the first year of Major League Baseball, he played for and managed the New York Mutuals. During that season, he was reportedly savagely beaten by a gambler for double-crossing him on a fix, a plot that would later be stolen by the movie White Men Can't Jump. So, fast forward a year later to 1877, and the combination of his questionable past and his refusal to turn over his telegrams was enough for MLB to banish him for life. Like Devlin, he tried to get reinstated. Like Devlin, he failed and became a police officer. There's definitely something hilarious about the criminal-to-cop pipeline that defined the era, and some would argue is still going strong today, but police reform is way outside of my pay grade, so we'll move on. I'm going to give Bill a 4 on the interesting scale, mainly because of his ability to get caught up in 3 separate gambling scandals in 8 years. Also, he gets a bonus point because he fought for the Union as part of their heavy artillery division, which you should all remember in case you need someone for the Louisville Grays / Civil War veteran square the next time you're playing Immaculate Grid. Next up, we have Joe Gerhardt, which is a name that just screams light-hitting, scrappy second baseman, and that's exactly what he was. In fact, old Joey Scraps was so scrappy that his nickname was Move 'em Up Joe, because when runners would get on base, he would scream, "Move 'em up," imploring his teammates to drop a sac bunt. In fact, I'll take it a step further and note that upon his death, a New York sports writer credited him as the inventor of the sacrifice in baseball. So if you're one of those baseball fans who grew up with a David Eckstein poster on your wall and you love David Fletcher because he plays the game the right way, then Joe Gerhardt is basically a god to you. But if you're like me and prefer players who can hit a ball out of the infield on the fly, this dork probably doesn't move the needle much. As we covered with Ross Barnes in the last episode, I'm not exactly wowed by guys who are dropping down sac bunts against pitchers throwing 75 and fielders without gloves. Take a fucking swing, you pussies. Maybe something good will happen. So what's interesting about Gerhardt? I mean, I guess the fact that he looks like a third grader wearing a fake mustache. You know, like if a third grader went missing and then 20 years later they wanted to put his picture on a milk carton, but they didn't have the digital aging technology back then to project what he would look like as a 28-year-old, so they just drew a mustache on his old class picture? Is that interesting? Probably not. I'm stretching here. Gerhardt did post a 6.46 range factor as a second baseman, a mark that still stands today as the all-time record. And honestly, that does more to discredit range factor than it does to bolster Scrappy Joe's resume. I'm tempted to give him a 1 here, but after retiring he worked at a hotel, a liquor store, and a cigar store, which is a nice little resume, so I'll move him up to a 2. See what I did there? Next up we have Bill Haig, and his entire Wikipedia entry is one boring paragraph. It does say above that, not to be confused with Bill Haig, spelled H-A-I-G, so I clicked on that guy to see if he did anything interesting. That Bill Haig was a professional cricketer who later opened his own ice cream shop, which is a little bit better, but not much. His entry says not to be confused with Bill Haig, spelled H-A-I-G-H, so I clicked on that guy too, and he was an Australian politician with the Labour Party who also didn't really do anything. 0 for 3 with 3 strikeouts. We were one Bill Haig away from a golden sombrero. This is going to be a 0. Okay, now it's time to get ridiculous. Remember how I said earlier that the gambling scandal was exposed for the dumbest possible reason? It's time to meet the guy who exposed it, John Haldeman. Haldeman's career lasted 1 game. On July 3rd, 1877, Haldeman went 0 for 4 and committed 3 errors. Seems like a rough game for a major league ball player, right? Well, here's the thing. Haldeman wasn't a major league ball player. He wasn't a ball player at all. Haldeman's father, Walter, was the owner of the Louisville Courier-Journal and the president of the Louisville Grays. As a result, Haldeman ended up with a pretty cushy job as a journalist, and one of his first assignments was to cover the Grays. Fast forward to July 3rd. Bill Craver is unable to play, so manager Jack Chapman does the only normal, rational thing possible. He shifts Joe Gerhardt to shortstop and asks the beat reporter to play second. I'm going to repeat that because I need everyone watching this to understand how insane it is. The team was shorthanded, so they put in the newspaper reporter. And you might say, well, nobody else was available. And to that I would say that the manager, Jack Chapman, played for the Grays the season before. That's right, Jack Chapman was a 34-year-old former major leaguer, and rather than grab a glove himself, he went with a newspaper reporter. Absolute insanity. Perhaps even more insane is the fact that the Grays won that game, defeating Cincinnati 6-3. The losing streak didn't happen for another 6 weeks, and it was Haldeman asking the questions that eventually exposed the truth. Haldeman questioned the team's sudden struggles, making note of several things that they had done that were atypical of winning teams. Somehow this list didn't include putting newspaper reporters in the lineup, but rather misplays in the field and on the base paths. Another piece of evidence that Haldeman gathered was the play of Al Nichols, who we'll be discussing in more detail a little bit later. Nichols was brought in mid-season to replace the injured Bill Haig, not to be confused with Bill Haig or Bill Haig, and this move was suggested by star outfielder George Hall. Spoiler alert, Nichols and Hall are the 2 remaining players to take part in the gambling scandal. The thing with Nichols is that he sucked, and once Haig was healthy enough to play again, they kept Nichols in anyway, which led to more losses. Now, there's a pretty significant logic lapse here, because the manager was the one making that lineup, and he wasn't implicated in the game fixing at all. So I don't really know how that works. If only there were some quality reporting on the incident to read. Alas, the reporter probably didn't have time to file his report because he was too busy playing second base. I'm sorry, I'll try to stop yelling, but it's just so batshit crazy. Like, imagine Brian Windhorst suiting up for the Miami Heat, or the Cowboys rolling with Skip Bayless at quarterback. Actually, come to think of it, watching Skip Bayless try to escape an all-out blitz would be hilarious. I take it back. This whole thing rules. Anyway, Haldeman's journalism led to the team's other owner, the one that wasn't Haldeman's dad, to lead the investigation into his own players and ultimately banish them. That owner's name was Charles E. Chase, and if you're browsing Wikipedia when you're tired enough, you glance down and think that this says Chuck E. Cheese, and then you start laughing uncontrollably because you're imagining a giant rat dressed in FUBU gear owning a 19th century baseball team, and that's obviously fucking preposterous. So yeah. Walter Haldeman was in charge of a newspaper and a baseball team, and he used those connections to get his son a job, and how did this little shit repay him? By causing the destruction of that baseball team. To me, the entire story isn't even about throwing games. It's about the dangers of snitching and being an unqualified Nepo baby who was put into a position of power. Haldeman went on to get married, have 3 kids, and die at 43. I couldn't find a cause of death anywhere, which is a bummer because dying at 43 back then likely meant some sort of goofy disease. By the way, fun fact, if you Google John Haldeman, the first result is actually for H.R. Haldeman, who was Richard Nixon's chief of staff during Watergate. After he was removed from office in disgrace, he was succeeded by Alexander Haig, spelled H-A-I-G, no relation to the professional cricketer with the ice cream shop. I don't know, I find that cool. It's hard to figure out a rating to give to Haldeman. Outside of that one thing, he didn't really do much of note, but that one thing was so over-the-top stupid that it has to get a high score. I'm going to give him an 8, and I implore more teams to start putting journalists in their starting lineups. I had high hopes for our next player, Juice Latham. That's an A+ Deadball era name. Next to Burley Grimes and Lil Stoner, Juice Latham is my favorite question in the game, 1877 baseball player or 2026 SoundCloud rapper. As if having the nickname Juice wasn't enough, he also went by the nickname Jumbo Latham, which is my favorite question in the game, 1877 baseball player or 1987 WWF villain. Anyway, despite the Grays disbanding after the season, Latham actually finished his career playing in Louisville. He played in the American Association for the Louisville Eclipse, which is my favorite question in the game, Deadball era baseball team or current WNBA franchise. Are you sick of this bit yet? Me too. Let's give Jumbo Juice 1 point for each of the 3 funny nicknames and then subtract 1 for being named Juice Latham and being that goddamn boring. That's a 2 out of 10. Next up is Harry Little, and what you're looking at right now is his entire Wikipedia entry top to bottom. No information whatsoever outside of his stats on Baseball Reference. They don't even have a picture. Little took 15 at-bats for the Grays and the St. Louis Brown Stockings in his only major league season, and his Grays stat line is as follows. 1 game, 0 for 3, 0.00 batting average. Tied for last on the team with a local newspaper reporter. I'm afraid Harry's going to have to take an 0 on the interesting scale as well. The Grays are at a 27 right now, and they're going to have to pick up the pace if they want to overtake Chicago's 46. Now we get to Al Nichols, and much like his performance on the field, he's not helping out a whole lot here. We've talked about Nichols a little bit already, but to recap, sucked at baseball, cost the team a pennant, got pinched in a game-fixing scandal, and kicked out of the sport. And if that wasn't enough negative shit to say about one guy, let me add this. He was British. Gross. Nichols became the first British-born player in MLB history when he suited up for the New York Mutuals the season before. And as an homage to this piece of history, Great Britain still uses jerseys from 1876 in the World Baseball Classic. Nichols would end up bringing great shame to his English ancestors, however, due in equal parts to his 171 career batting average and the whole gambling thing. And honestly, I'm having a hard time buying Nichols as a true co-conspirator in this scandal. I mean, yes, he confessed. And yes, the telegrams described the plan in great detail, and that is pretty damning evidence. But here's the thing. What if he was really trying his best out there and just lied about throwing games to save face? What if he would rather just be known as a criminal than a genuinely terrible ball player? What if all the good players were talking about throwing games and he was just sending them telegrams like, LOL, yeah, I ain't even trying out there, dog. I missed those balls on purpose. Ha ha ha. Or wait, sorry, I forgot he was British. Oi, bruv, I'm just taking the piss out there. Don't get your knickers in a twist, lads. That's the best British voice I can do. So what's the truth? We may never know. One thing we do know is that outside of being British and banned from baseball, there is nothing interesting about Al Nichols. He gets a 2. Now we move to the outfield, and we start with Bill Crowley, who looks like his cause of death was Freddie Mercury poisoning. Nah, I'm just goofing. It was an old-timey kidney infection called Bright's disease. He died at 34. It's very sad, actually. Anyway, Crowley's claim to fame was his right arm, as he threw out 4 base runners from the outfield in a single game in 1880. And then later in the season, did it again. Stop running on my boy Bill. Put some respect on his arm. Crowley didn't get caught up in the whole gambling scandal, but he did end up getting banished from the sport in 1881 anyway for, quote, general dissipation and insubordination, which included drunkenness and rowdy behavior. Now here's the thing, Bill was born in Philadelphia to Irish immigrants, and as a fellow Irishman from Philly, let me be very clear here, drunkenness and rowdy behavior is kind of our whole deal. It would be like getting mad at Al Nichols for eating beans on toast or having poor dental hygiene. It's just not fair. Crowley would be reinstated in 1883, but he was out of the game 2 years later after a bizarre final season for a terrible team called the Buffalo Bisons. In mid-September, the Bisons were bought out by the Detroit Wolverines, and some of the players attempted to play for Detroit before the league interfered. In the last 3 weeks of the season, the Bisons were forced to play with mostly local fill-ins, although Crowley seems to have remained on the roster as they limped to an 0-16-1 finish. Crowley played his last game on October 10th of that year and died less than 6 years later. He's buried in Belmar, New Jersey, a small town just outside of Philly with a modern-day population of 11,000. It also happens to be where my dad grew up and only 1 mile from my childhood home. Man, really is a small world after all, you know? Like, it's gigantic, but I feel like we're all connected in some way. Like, you ever look up at the moon and think, man, somebody on the other side of the country is looking at that same moon? Like, we're not that far apart. We are, but we're not, you know what I'm saying? Alright, I'm freestyling now. None of this is in the script. I gotta give a score to that guy, right? 4. Next up, we have the final member of the scandal, George Hall. Before we go any further, I'm going to give George a point for hitting the "I'm a little teapot" pose in his Wikipedia picture here. That's a lot of sass for a 19th century baseball player, and I respect it. Hall was another British bloke, and I'm guessing the second one in Major League history after his buddy Al Nichols. Nichols and Hall, two Brits trying to infiltrate and corrupt America's pastime, but getting shut the fuck down. It's the Revolutionary War all over again. Those two successfully tarnished England's reputation for decades here in the States, until the Beatles and Mr. Bean showed up and won us over. Anyway, back to Hall. The main difference between him and Nichols is that Hall was actually really good. Remember when I covered the pathetic offense of the Grays in 1876? Hall was a Philadelphia Athletic that season, posting a ridiculous 366, 384, 545 slash line while setting a Major League record with 5 home runs. He fell off a bit with the Grays in 77 as he still hit 323 but didn't launch a single homer. Still, his 791 OPS led the team by a wide margin. Hall also might have hit for the first cycle in Major League history. He was credited with 5 hits in an 1876 game, a home run, a single, and 3 triples, although many eyewitnesses said that one of the triples should have been a double and he was robbed of a cycle. The first undisputed cycle would end up going to Curry Foley in 1882, and that's why Curry Foley is a household name today and nobody remembers George Hall. Now, I was going to avoid talking further about the game-throwing scandal here because we've covered it pretty thoroughly, but it's worth mentioning that in Hall's Wikipedia entry, it says that him and Jim Devlin only admitted to throwing exhibition games. See, back then, teams would play exhibition games during the season to make a little bit of extra money, and according to Hall, those were the only games he threw. And if that's true, it changes things quite a bit. I guess we'll never know. You know, unless one of my viewers is sitting on a treasure trove of 150-year-old baseball telegrams and wants to send them my way for a follow-up video. Overall, I'll give Hall a 5. British guy, home run record, maybe a cycle, some criminal activity, allegedly, sassiness overload in the profile pic, not bad. Next up is legendary two-way player Flip Lafferty. Flip pitched in one game in 1876, gave up 3 unearned runs, and lost. Then he went 1 for 17 as a center fielder in 1877. Then he never played in the majors again. This is like that meme where the kid asks his mom if they can get Shohei Ohtani, and she says, "We have Shohei Ohtani at home." Anyway, Shohei Ohtani at home gets 0 points. The final player on the roster is Orator Schaefer, and with just a quick glance at the first screen grab of his Wikipedia entry, I know he's going to give us some classic Deadball era bullshit. Let's see here. Goofy nickname? Check. Elite athlete at 5'9", 165? Check. Male pattern baldness and a mustache? Check. 50 outfield assists in a 73-game season? Check. Off to a good start here. In all, Schaefer led the league in outfield assists 4 different times for 4 different teams. Have gun, will travel. And you might be asking, why did a man who was one of the greatest right fielders of his era switch teams so often? Well, for one, there weren't really any contracts back then. You just kind of did what you wanted. If your current team was paying you $8 a game and another team a few states over was offering $9, you threw your belongings into a bag on the end of a stick, hopped on the back of a moving freight train, and ate beans out of a can until you arrived in your new home. Also, teams didn't really stick around back then. We've already talked about how the Grays would disappear after this season and covered the whole Buffalo Bisons, Detroit Wolverines mess. This was the grand opening, grand closing era of professional sports, and early baseball teams were like NFTs. Everybody got excited for a few months, but then down the line they were like, I can't believe I wasted money on that crap. Schaefer, in particular, was an angel of death for his first couple franchises, as he played on the Grays in their final season in '77, before moving to the Indianapolis Blues for their only season in '78. After that, he moved on to the Chicago White Stockings in '79, and that's where he gave us a grade A 19th century story. Orator Schaefer and Silver Flint were teammates on both Indianapolis and Chicago, and when they left Indiana, they did so with some unpaid debts. The Stockings traveled to Indy in 1879 only to find that the local sheriff was waiting to arrest Schaefer and Flint. The cops let the ballgame go down first and then moved in for the apprehension after, but Schaefer and Flint were able to escape the ballpark in a horse-drawn carriage and evade 12. They got the hell out of Indiana and never returned to pay their debts. And as if that's not cool enough, the cops did manage to arrest player/manager Cap Anson, who, as we covered in our last video, was a terrible racist. So that rules. Fleeing the Popo and leading them on a high-speed horse and buggy chase was definitely the highlight of Schaefer's off-the-field career, but his on-field run wasn't too shabby either. Schaefer ended his MLB tenure with exactly 1,000 hits and 11 home runs, which might not sound like impressive numbers now, but keep in mind the ball back then was a wet newspaper. His offensive peak came in that 1878 Indianapolis season where he led the league in both WAR and OPS+, stats that people were definitely familiar with and cared about back then. And as for the nickname Orator, I'm not entirely sure how to judge that. His Wikipedia says that he was given the nickname because he was an avid speaker, which I took to mean in a positive way, like he was eloquent and articulate. But then if you scroll down a little bit, it says that he was a great stickler for his rights and spoke to himself when not talking to the umpire, which sounds more like he just complained a whole lot. Either way, with or without the nickname, Orator has enough going on to get a 6 in the interesting scale, a score boosted heavily by the great daring Indianapolis horse escape of 1878. So now we get to the manager, Jack Chapman, and the game is in his hands. The White Stockings scored a 46 last episode, and the Grays currently sit at a 44. Chapman's got a great chance to walk it off here. Let's see what he does. First off, I noticed that there's no picture on his Wikipedia, and that's a bad sign. Usually if Wikipedia doesn't have a picture, they also don't have any good information. Plus, I had been saving up a sweet bit of wordplay where I was going to say, as the manager, Chapman was the most important part of the Gray's anatomy, which explains why he looks so McDreamy. You know, like the TV show? I don't know, I thought it was pretty good. Anyway, Chapman's claim to fame is that he was half responsible for there being no World Series winner in 1890. At that time, the winner of the National League took on the winner of the American Association, stick with me here, and the winner would be named the World Series champion. I guess the modern day equivalent of this would be the Dodgers versus the Savannah Bananas or something, I don't know. The point is, Chapman was managing the Louisville Colonels of the American Association and going up against the Brooklyn Bridegrooms of the National League in a best-of-7 series, and after Brooklyn took a 2-0 lead, Game 3 ended in a tie. Then Louisville took 2 out of the next 3, so they went to Game 7 with Brooklyn up 3-2. Now you might be asking, why didn't they just go back and keep playing Game 3 until someone wins? And to that I say, how the fuck would I know? This was like 100 years before I was born. So anyway, Chapman and the Brooklyn manager got together and agreed that Game 7 would be the final game they played. Unless Louisville won, then it wouldn't be. They would play again the following season to break the tie and determine the true winner. It seems easier to just play Game 8 the next day instead of waiting 6 months, especially when the bubonic plague or black lung or something could wipe out half your team over the winner, but they settled on this dumb plan. Louisville won Game 7, and then the agreement between the AA and the NL fell apart in the offseason, and they never played again. And really, that's the only noteworthy thing on Jack Chapman's page. Oh, that, and his nickname was Death to Flying Things, which they just casually mention with no explanation, and then add that there was another major leaguer with the same nickname. I'm sorry, what the fuck? 2 guys with the nickname Death to Flying Things. What are we doing, 19th century? So Chapman needed a 2 to tie and a 3 to win, and I just can't do it. Sorry, to beat the champ you gotta knock him out, and screwing up a World Series and having a dumb nickname isn't gonna be enough to get it done. Chappie gets a 1, the Grays get a 45, and much like their 1877 season, they fall apart down the stretch. Personally, I blame the Brits. Okay, that's it. Episode 2 of the Deadball Chronicles is in the books. If you like this nonsense, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It's new and I'm trying to make fun content, so please like and comment and do whatever it takes to please our algorithm overlords. I long for the day when this channel blows up and I can make my living by doing ad reads for microwavable meal subscription services or ED pills or whatever. Please help me make that happen. Until next time, I'm Pat Barker, and these are the Deadball Chronicles.